Ziding, thank you for joining our podcast. Today, we're continuing our discussion on the situation in Iran.
Hello, Fang Fei. Hello to all our viewers.
All right, Ziding. We saw that today President Trump posted a new tweet about this, Iran. In this tweet, he said that the people we are negotiating with in Iran right now are new people, and they are very reasonable. But if we can't reach an agreement with them soon, or if the Strait of Hormuz can't be opened quickly, then we'll have to deliver a final blow to Iran, destroying their power plants, oil wells, and Karg Island, everything. Basically, what this means is either we reach an agreement or we destroy everything. This is pretty much another one of Trump's ultimatums. I've lost count of how many there have been. Anyway, that's how it feels. It's just another ultimatum. Then today, a reporter called Trump for an interview, and Trump revealed that the person we're negotiating with is Iran's parliamentary speaker, Kalibafov. He pretty much confirmed that he's talking to Kalibafov. Now, when Kalibafov addresses the public, he also takes a very tough stance. I saw a report today where he said, if American soldiers dare to set foot on Iranian soil, we'll turn them to dust. So both sides are being extremely tough in their rhetoric. Honestly, I don't see much chance of them reaching an agreement anytime soon. What do you think?
I don't see it either. The gap is still pretty big because I saw a news report today saying that the U.S. recently proposed a 15-point agreement, right? And it seems like Iran is finding it really hard to accept. There are a lot of things that are just unacceptable to them, including, as you mentioned, restrictions on ballistic missiles, among other things. Iran has set several conditions that are hard for the U.S. to accept. They're demanding a full U.S. troop withdrawal from the Middle East and control over the Strait to collect future tolls. The U.S. won't agree, so as things stand now, there are major differences between the two sides, but Iran is taking a tougher stance. Iran's tough attitude comes from two main reasons. First, at the negotiating table, Iran still has some bargaining chips. Second, it's also about sending a message to its own people, especially regarding the Revolutionary Guard issue. The Revolutionary Guard is relatively hardline, so if Iran can represent itself in negotiations, it will definitely get some level of support from the Revolutionary Guard. Or to put it another way, the terms of the negotiations can't be too far off from what the Revolutionary Guard wants. So I think the progress is very slow. Just think about it. Earlier, when we saw news reports, they said the talks would be on Thursday, but then they were pushed to the weekend. Now, a whole week has passed, and the progress in the talks between the two sides is basically next to nothing. Zero, meaning we really have no idea how far the two sides have gotten in their talks. So looking at the progress over the past week, you can pretty much predict that the next week or even the next 2 weeks, this negotiation process is going to be extremely slow. But during this process, since both sides are still fighting, and fighting means that the bargaining chips on the negotiating table could change. So personally, I think it's very likely that the U.S. will launch a ground offensive in the near future to shift the dynamics at the negotiating table. Because just like when the Iranians take a hardline stance, or in the case of the war in Ukraine, if you can achieve something militarily, why would you give it up at the negotiating table? So that's just my take on it.
We'll talk about ground troops in a moment, but first I want to ask about Trump's threat. He said that if an agreement can't be reached quickly, including reopening the Strait of Hormuz immediately, he would bomb Iran's power plants, oil wells, and Karg Island. Most people think the latter two are very likely, but the power plants seem a bit strange to me. Why would he want to bomb power plants? Some people say that if you bomb the power plants in such a large region, there would be no electricity or water, and that could quickly lead to a humanitarian disaster. Iranians might not even have water to drink, and people could die of thirst, or there could be mass casualties. That would create huge political pressure at home, and Iranians might stop supporting you. So what do you think about Trump's threat to bomb power plants? First, why did he make such a threat? And second, do you think he would really go through with it?
If the power plant ultimatum actually works, then Trump wouldn't have to keep delaying or even possibly delay things further. In other words, bombing the power plants is really a double-edged sword. Let's first talk about its impact on Iran, because electricity, it's actually the backbone of industry. You need electricity for everything you do, including military operations. For example, Iran's command centers, communication hubs, radar equipment, and even the normal functioning of its bases all rely on electricity. Of course, they might have backup power sources, most places do, but if you bomb the main power plants, it would have a huge impact on the entire system's operations. Then there's the effect on society as a whole. Without electricity, your entire industrial capacity, whether it's steel mills, factories related to other industries, or plants producing ammunition and missiles, would all be affected. Plus, Iran's industry is relatively concentrated in a few major cities. So if you strike the power facilities in those cities, you'll see results very quickly. And power generation is interconnected. It's a network. So if you target some key power plants, in a situation where demand remains constant while supply decreases, the entire power grid will experience significant instability, potentially even leading to a complete power outage. For example, Spain recently experienced a nationwide blackout for 12 hours due to the instability of some so-called renewable energy sources, causing grid instability. Therefore, attacks on some power generation infrastructure can have a significant impact on the entire power grid or even a localized area, thus subtly influencing the socioeconomic and political landscape. Of course, by targeting the economy and military, it aims to weaken the foundation of the Iranian regime's rule within Iran is also what has caused divisions within the country. We've seen reports, for example, that Galibafo, the current Speaker of Parliament, was previously reported by Israeli media, Channel 12, we're not entirely sure of the veracity of this report, to have accused the Iranian Secretary of State and the Commander-in-Chief of the Security Council of embezzling funds, saying things like, "You've taken all the money, but now you can't distribute it," and so on. So there are conflicts between the two sides, but from what I've seen so far, these conflicts haven't escalated to the point of being major. If the situation develops to the point of creating a large enough rift, even leading to the establishment of a separate central government, then returning to the other side of this dual-term boundary, it will also have a significant impact on the United States. For example, if these infrastructure projects are damaged, as you just mentioned, electricity for ordinary citizens will become a problem. Their daily lives will become problematic. Industrial production will be impossible. The processing of many agricultural products will be disrupted. The operation of the entire society will be affected. Will food security become an issue and hospitals will experience power outages? This will have a huge impact on people. While some good hospitals may have backup power sources or their own generators, how long can these last? The humanitarian disaster will have an extremely large impact on the Trump administration, both domestically and internationally. Firstly, as the war progressed, many Iranians, the vast majority, did support the U.S. in fighting the current Islamic regime. However, when there are large-scale power outages, especially those lasting a long time, the hearts of the Iranian people begin to change. For example, in Ukraine, the majority of Iranians support the regime. Zelensky and the Ukrainian people were very supportive of resisting Russia, but we can see that public opinion in Ukraine has changed significantly over the past 3 years. In the first year of the war, when Ukraine's counteroffensive was going well, the vast majority of people did not support peace talks. But now, with the war dragging on to this point, actually, many people now support peace. But how the peace terms are negotiated is another matter. Even ceding territory is something they can accept, because with power outages happening every few days and the war dragging on for 3 or 4 years, their daily lives are deeply affected. For example, if you look at people like Nikita or Wanky Chan on Twitter, you can really sense this mindset from their posts. So if the US launches large-scale attacks on power generation, it will definitely have an impact on public opinion inside Iran, and it will also have international repercussions, especially since Trump is currently, whether it's in US domestic politics or on the international stage, there are already some unfavorable trends. So this would create even more pressure for him. That's why I think this is a double-edged sword and must be used with extreme caution.
Yeah, I think he made this threat, but if things don't go smoothly, or if there are repeated incidents in the Strait, it will also be a tough problem for Trump. How exactly is he going to make good on this threat in reality? Now, speaking of ground troops, I want to ask, because from what I've seen, all the news is about troops gathering in the Middle East. For example, according to U.S. media, in the end, Central Command is planning, right now, the plan is to send 17,000 U.S. soldiers to the Middle East. Some may already be in place, and there could be an additional 10,000 sent. Also, I saw in the New York Times and other media that among the U.S. troops being deployed to the Middle East, there are also special forces. I remember last time on our show, you mentioned that in your assessment, some special forces should have already gone, including Rangers, Navy SEALs, and so on. So, how do you see the overall situation? First, what kind of missions do you think this number of troops can accomplish? And second, what do you think these special forces might be sent to do?
I'll answer this question in two parts. First, I'll talk about the current number of troops being deployed, and then I'll discuss the special forces. In terms of numbers, 18,000 or 17,500 troops. First of all, 10,000 troops are the ones being sent as reinforcements. These are the planned reinforcements, and this was reported by the Wall Street Journal last weekend. Let's first talk about the roughly 8,000 troops. These forces have already been deployed to the Middle East as reinforcements. They include 5,000 Marines and 3,000 soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division. The 5,000 Marines are from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, which previously set out from Okinawa, Japan, and has now arrived in the Middle East. Another 2,500 troops from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit set out from California and are currently still at sea in the Pacific. It's estimated that they'll reach the Middle East in 2 or 3 weeks. In addition, there's also the U.S. 8th Airborne Division, the 8th Airborne Division. It's divided into 3 airborne brigade combat teams. Each brigade is about 3,000 troops. In addition, there's an aviation brigade. According to the latest information, since one of the brigade's units is already at the front line, they've already made combat preparations. So these are the troops everyone is familiar with. As for the remaining 10,000 troops, who could they be? We can only speculate because I checked the reports and they didn't specify. It's possible there are other units from the 101st Airborne Division, for example. There are about 2,800 to 3,000 aviation combat troops because the 101st Airborne Division, if they want to go into combat, they need vehicles. That is, my paratroopers can be transported to the front lines by transport aircraft, but once they're at the front, how do they move to islands or attack bases? We know that the 101st Airborne Division does parachute drops, like during World War II, the Normandy landings, or Operation Market Garden. They were all transported by helicopters. Then they strapped on their parachute packs and jumped out of the plane. But that's not suitable for Iran's situation. Why? Because when you parachute down, you're affected by wind direction and weather conditions, so there's a certain area you might land in. When you jump, you could end up anywhere within that range. The American standard has something called a drop zone, or DZ. There's a standard calculation for the total area, right? Yes, 600 feet by 600 feet is for one person. If you have 2 people, you add a bit more. And for 3 people, you add a bit more again. So if you calculate it this way, it means you're dropping a whole battalion unit. Its coverage area is quite large. The islands we're discussing, whether it's Hark Island, Hormuz Island, or the Greater and Lesser Tomb Islands, these islands are just too small. Plus, on these islands, like Hark Island, there are a lot of buildings. Its northeast corner is an airport, the eastern part is a port, and in the center there are more than 20 large pipelines. Then, around this airport, there are residential areas and military zones, so when you parachute in, it's best to have an open area, and preferably a large open area for parachuting. Hawk Island doesn't have these conditions, so the 101st Airborne would be deployed to the front lines. They definitely wouldn't use an airdrop method for combat. There's only one possibility, which is a forced landing. So what is a forced landing? An airdrop means I parachute from a transport plane, but a forced landing means I don't parachute at all. I ride in a helicopter and descend from it when it's about 10 meters off the ground. Actually, you descend really fast. And yes, there's also a rope for this. But with helicopters, there's an issue with the vehicles themselves, but it's not a big deal. What's important is that the 111th Brigade has an aviation combat brigade. If I remember correctly, this aviation combat brigade is equipped with, if I'm not mistaken, 48 Apache attack helicopters, mainly 24 or maybe 48 in total. I'm a bit fuzzy on the exact number, but it's something like that. The Apache attack helicopters are mainly used to provide ground fire support and suppressive fire. Basically, if you stick your head out, I'll shoot you. If you pop up, I'll shoot you. So it provides fire support. Besides that, there are about 52 Black Hawk helicopters, with the first 30 mainly used for assault transport. A single Black Hawk helicopter can carry about 11 people, so together they can transport over 300 people. There are also more than 20 Black Hawks used for medical and command purposes. Of course, if you temporarily refit them to carry people, that's possible too. So basically, that's how it works. With more than 50 Black Hawk helicopters, you can transport about 300 to 500 people to the front lines for combat. In addition, there are 12 Chinook transport helicopters. Chinooks, these transport helicopters are large transport aircraft. You also saw them in action during our operation in Venezuela. There are Black Hawk helicopters, smaller helicopters, and also those big helicopters. The Chinook has two rotors on top that spin in opposite directions, which balances the torque. A Chinook transport helicopter can carry about 30 to 50 combat soldiers. So with more than a dozen Chinook transport helicopters, they can also carry over 100 people. So when you add it all up, through the 101st Airborne Division, the Special Aviation Brigade under the 82nd Airborne Division, in a single wave, they can deploy about 800 to 1,000 troops to the front line. Of course, if you bring some heavy equipment, the number will be a bit less. If the 82nd Airborne takes action, its aviation brigade must be present. It's the most likely unit for deployment, though other units could also be sent. Personally, I think it would be the other combat brigades of the 82nd Airborne Division. One brigade is deployed, leaving two more ready for immediate use. The 82nd Airborne is always ready at a moment's notice, unlike other units. Take, for example, the Abrams main battle tanks and the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles used by the 1st Armored Division and others. These heavy pieces of equipment probably have to be transported by sea. Even if you try to airlift them, it would still take a lot of time. The 101st Airborne, when the 82nd Airborne is deployed, the 101st is airborne as well. During assaults, they're all light infantry, just like you said. If you look at the 82nd Airborne, they don't have tanks or any kind of heavy equipment like that. All their armored vehicles are light armored vehicles because they need to be rapidly deployed. They have to be able to deploy anywhere in the world within 18 hours to carry out operations. So they have to be fast to meet this requirement. There's another branch, another unit, which is the Marine Corps Arctic Combat Team. The 5,000 people we mentioned earlier are part of the Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is a completely different setup from the Arctic Combat Team. It moves along with the amphibious fleet, so what we see is that the first unit follows the USS Delaboli, an amphibious assault ship, along with two dock landing ships. The second one follows the USS All-Division Amphibious Ready Group departing from California, and all the equipment is loaded onto the ships. It has amphibious assault vehicles, and it also has its own equipment. The air wing includes Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft and F-35 fighter jets. But the Littoral Combat Regiment is different. The Littoral Combat Regiment was specifically created for the Asia Pacific. In plain terms, it was set up to counter the Chinese Communist Party. Littoral Combat Regiment. Currently, there are 3 expeditionary units and 7 littoral combat regiments. They're lightweight, meaning all their weapons can be transported by helicopter. They don't rely on transport by ship because they can be deployed quickly. Right now, there is 1 littoral combat regiment stationed in Okinawa, another in Iwakuni, and 1 in Guam. Their operational requirement is that once war breaks out, the Okinawa Littoral Combat Regiment must be deployed immediately to Yonaguni Island and Ishigaki Island, and then the Guam Littoral Combat Regiment must be deployed immediately to the Philippines and Hawaii. They must be deployed to Okinawa right away to blockade the first island chain. So they quickly arrive by transport aircraft. What role do the submarines play? They rely on the islands to provide sea and air control. What does that mean? It means there are combat operations going on underneath. There's a unit specifically responsible for maritime operations, and it's equipped with the NSM anti-ship missile. This includes HIMRs, which can launch other types of missiles, including the Typhoon system. For example, the Typhoon can launch Tomahawk missiles and Standard 6 missiles as well. So basically, I can rely on this island to control the area within 200 to 500 kilometers around it. That's the range. I can control it all. If your warships come over, I can hit you. At the same time, I also have air defense units, so if your planes come, I can shoot you down. So this is the configuration of the Arctic Sea Battle Group. It's not set up for amphibious landings. Of course, it does have a core infantry combat battalion, but this infantry combat battalion, its main job is to provide ground protection. Its primary mission actually isn't to conduct landings. Of course, it can also serve a landing function in certain scenarios, so the Arctic Sea Battle Group can move quickly. Let me give an example. Moving from the Asia-Pacific region to the Middle East. Say I capture a certain island, I take over a particular island. After that, I send the Arctic Sea Battle Group to guard the area, and then I can pull out the rest of my troops to handle other tasks. This is just my personal speculation, but the remaining 10,000 troops might be made up of the 82nd Airborne Division, the Arctic Sea Battle Group, and Special Forces. Now, let's talk about these Special Forces. This is actually pretty interesting because about a week ago, we saw a large number of transport planes taking off from Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Fort Bragg is very special because it's the base of the 82nd Airborne Division, and it's also home to several U.S. Army Special Forces units. For example, the Rangers, the 75th Ranger Regiment is there, as well as the Army's most famous Delta Force. So far, from all the information I've seen, there have been mentions of Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the Rangers, and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Their missions are all different. The Special Forces are divided into tiers. These are called Tier 1, 2, and 3. The most famous Tier 1 units are Delta Force and SEAL Team 6. Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 are set up with slightly different purposes, meaning they're not quite the same as other special forces. They carry out the most elite, most covert counterterrorism missions, like eliminating enemy leaders. To give a simple example, just
Bin Laden, for example.
the Neptune Spear operation against bin Laden was a standout performance by SEAL Team 6. At that time, they took off from an airbase in Afghanistan, flew stealth Black Hawk helicopters, and raided bin Laden's residence near Islamabad, Pakistan. After bin Laden was killed, the helicopters flew to an aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea for a debrief. SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force has also had two recent high-profile missions. One was the capture of Juan Guaido, who was taken from the Caribbean and quickly brought back. The other was Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. If I remember correctly, in 2021, Baghdadi was killed in Syria by U.S. forces, and it was also Delta Force that carried out the operation. They took helicopters to a compound in Syria where Baghdadi was hiding, and in the end, Baghdadi, with no way out, detonated his own suicide vest and died. So these units carry out the most high-stakes missions. Now, let's talk about the Rangers, also known as the Army Rangers, and the SEALs. The SEALs and the Rangers are considered the second tier, while SEAL Team 6, even though it sounds similar to the regular SEALs, is actually completely different. SEAL Team 6 later became its own unit. Officially, SEAL Team 6 is part of the U.S. Special Operations Command, so it's already distinct from the regular SEAL teams. In terms of numbers, you can see the difference. There are about 3,000 Rangers, over 2,000 SEALs, and as for Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, both have only a few hundred members, around 200 to 300 people each. So, how do we evaluate the Rangers? The Rangers are essentially elite infantry. The Rangers operate as a regimental command unit with 3 battalions. They've participated in many conventional wars, and their role in those wars is to serve as the main assault force, attacking the enemy's most critical positions. For example, if I'm attacking a bridgehead, the Rangers would be the ones leading the assault on the enemy.
They're basically the vanguard, right?
They're basically the vanguard, kind of like special operations in conventional warfare, because they have more people. If you have 3,000 people, you can take on a strategic objective, right? But SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force can't do that. They only have 200 or 300 people. With just 200 or 300 people in conventional warfare, that's just not enough, right? So, for example, SEALs, there are about 2,000 of them. And then there's another Special Forces unit, the 160th, nicknamed the Night Stalkers. We've seen the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment in a lot of places because the helicopters that Delta Force uses are provided by the 160th. Delta Force itself doesn't fly helicopters, so they're equipped with Black Hawks and modified versions for ground attack. They don't have Apache attack helicopters. Their ground fire support relies on these modified Black Hawks. So the 160th always has to be deployed because if you're carrying out special operations, what aircraft are you going to use? That's right, the 160th provides the helicopters. It's the 160th. Exactly. No matter the weather conditions or the time of day, I can guarantee I'll reach the target with a margin of plus or minus 30 seconds because special operations are all about extremely precise timing. No matter what time you need to be at a certain place or what place you need to be at a certain time, they can achieve that level of precision under any weather conditions in any situation. So if you're going to war, you definitely need the 160th. Now let's look at this. I was actually pretty surprised by it today. Seeing these Rangers, because if you're carrying out small-scale special operations, actually SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force would be enough. But if the Rangers are deployed, sometimes the U.S. Special Forces operate in mixed units. Like during the Battle of Mogadishu, they would select a mix. There were both Delta Force and Ranger members involved. But if it's about seizing Iran's nuclear materials, the nuclear fuel we know about, then I have a bit more to say. Because we know that
Last year,
the U.S. bombed the enrichment facility. A lot of viewers might wonder, if it was bombed last year, why are we talking about it again now? Actually, it's not the same thing. Last year, when the US bombed Iran, they mainly targeted Iran's underground uranium enrichment facilities. To refine enriched uranium, you need centrifuges, not just one or two, but thousands of them working together in series. And as we know, whether it's in Natanz or Isfahan, they started building underground halls. Inside, there are a huge number of centrifuges. So what the US bombed at the time were these underground halls. Blowing up these centrifuges means that Iran's 60% enriched uranium will always stay at 60%. You won't have the industrial capability to further enrich it. That's why the US says, we've destroyed Iran's nuclear weapons capability, because at this point, Iran simply can't further refine enriched uranium. But this more than 400 kilograms of enriched uranium is still there. Just think about it. Over 400 kilograms of enriched uranium doesn't take up much space, and the US military and Israel already know where it is. There are a few theories. Some say part of it is hidden at Natanz, some at Isfahan, and together it adds up to over 400 kilograms. But now Iran has already moved it to another underground nuclear facility called Qom Mountain. Qom Mountain is located about 50 kilometers north of Natanz. It's also located 100 meters below the granite layer inside the mountain, which is about 40 or 60 meters deeper than the Fordo nuclear facility we learned about last year. I can't quite remember. That means it's twice as deep. This is relatively difficult for a US patented operation, so it's possible to launch a surprise attack on the nuclear facility and take away the nuclear fuel. But this means you need a very complex operational situation because there are military bases around the nuclear facility. How do you get in and out? Besides controlling the nuclear facility, you also need to control the surrounding military outposts. Therefore, it's possible that the actual operation involves more than just 100 or 200 people. It could be much larger. For example, some core assault teams might be from Delta Force, the US Nuclear Dispossession Team, and 3 teams in Maryland. These nuclear dispossession teams will also be involved in the combat because regarding nuclear fuel, these specialists must be involved. Delta Force 6 primarily carries out this kind of combat and force mission, so this is another special disposal unit. So let's return to the Iranian nuclear facility. This means that the US operation is likely quite different from previous operations against bin Laden or Baghdad. The scale could be even larger, and this might require the Rangers. The Rangers could be mechanized infantry, possibly providing some external protection. For example, when they captured Maduro, the operation was split into 2 groups. One group went straight into the 5th Fortress to capture Maduro directly, while the other group went to control the surrounding area and provide protection, right? So going back to the Iranian nuclear facility, it's possible that guerrilla forces would be responsible for providing protection around the island, while the most elite units like SEAL Team 6 or the Special Forces from North Carolina would carry out the core tasks. They would be responsible for entering the nuclear facility and seizing the nuclear fuel.
You just mentioned SEAL Team 6, but didn't go into detail, because what you said about Tier 1 refers to Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, right? Tier 1 is Delta and SEAL Team 6. So what about Tier 2? Is that the Rangers and which other unit?
Rangers, SEALs, and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment.
So are both Tier 1 and Tier 2 SEAL Team 6?
No, Tier 1 is SEAL Team 6, and Tier 2 is the regular SEAL teams, the SEAL teams. Right now, there are 8 SEAL teams under the command, and SEAL Team 6 used to be just one of them. But later on, SEAL Team 6 was given, they were just too outstanding and accomplished so much. They carried out a lot of special missions. So SEAL Team 6 is no longer just a part of the regular SEAL teams. Of course, we still call it SEAL Team 6 in name because SEAL Team 6 is just so famous. Its official name is the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, if I remember correctly, so its formal name has actually changed. But for convenience, we all still call it SEAL Team 6. Everyone knows what you mean when you say that. If you use the other name, people might not recognize it.
So SEAL Team 6 has a few hundred members. Delta Force also has a few hundred. Well, regular SEAL teams have about 2,000.
There are also 8 commando teams.
Okay, everyone, today I'm still introducing the Jeju Island Red Sea Cucumber Health Gel from South Korea, which is frequently sold out. This Red Sea Cucumber is made from wild Red Sea cucumbers harvested by Hanyo, female divers in Jeju Island, South Korea. It has excellent restorative effects, a very high repurchase rate, and limited production, which is why it's often out of stock. I'd like to share a real case with you. A woman in China had an 88-year-old father who suffered from knee pain and couldn't walk, so he was confined to a wheelchair. After hearing about our program, the woman decided to give it a try and bought 60 capsules, which were shipped to China. Her father only consumed a little over half of them, but he felt a significant improvement in his joints and was able to walk again. Now, the Red Sea cucumber is available in 2 customized packs every month. The promotional offer is that if you buy 60 or 30 Red Sea cucumbers, you'll receive either deep yellow body slimming tablets or a Korean repairing sunscreen. Additionally, during the promotional period, monthly subscribers will receive a $10 deep yellow product voucher. If you don't want to subscribe or make regular purchases, that's fine too. Just use my discount code FANGFEI for a 15% discount on single purchases. Thank you, friend. You can click the link below the video for more details. However, I think that U.S. deployment in the Middle East isn't necessarily all of it. For example, 3,000 guerrillas might only be deployed in a portion, and the Navy SEALs might also only be deployed in a portion, right?
All these kinds of special operations are overseen by the Special Operations Command. So it's possible for them to pool personnel from different departments as needed. For example, in the US, during the Black Hawk Down incident in Mogadishu, it wasn't just one unit involved. There were Delta Force operators and others. So depending on the mission, they select the people they need for the operation.
Yes, exactly. So now, when I see what Haggerty said, what he means is that we have a lot of options. No matter what the mission is, whether it's seizing enriched uranium or capturing an island, we have many choices. For the military, they need to present all these options and possibilities, for example, to the president or other decision makers. And ultimately, it's President Trump who decides whether or not to take action, whether or not to use these options. So it seems like these special forces might be related to the mission of seizing enriched uranium. I saw media reports saying that seizing enriched uranium is indeed very complicated, because first, you have to clear any dangers in the surrounding area before soldiers can go in. Once inside, you have to figure out how to access the uranium, which is stored in pipelines. When moving these pipelines, you have to be careful not to break them. After moving them out, there's also the issue of how to transport them away. You might even need to build a small quarantine airfield nearby. The whole operation is extremely complex. Some military experts have said that if you really want to do this, it's not something that can be completed in just 2 or 3 weeks. So overall, if you include both capturing the island and seizing the enriched uranium, the entire timeline would be extended.
Of course, it would take longer. I think, relatively speaking, the operation to seize enriched uranium would take less time if everything goes smoothly, because the US mission is pretty straightforward. Just take the enriched uranium away. But the mission itself is actually very dangerous because it goes deep into Iran's territory, into the mountains near Natanz. Whether we're talking about Natanz, Isfahan, or Fordo, they're all located in the mountainous areas just south of Tehran. They're actually quite far from the Gulf. Plus, to transport so many people, you can't use fixed-wing aircraft to fly in. You have to use helicopters, whether it's Black Hawk helicopters or others. The problem is that helicopters fly slowly. If they can manage a few hundred kilometers per hour, that's already pretty good. But even with Black Hawk or light utility helicopters, they're even faster. So if you have to stay inside Iran for a long time, it could bring some potential problems. And that's something the US has to consider. So if they really want to do it, I think it would be an operation even more complicated than the ones to capture Baghdadi, Maduro, or even what we saw with bin Laden. As for seizing islands, it really depends on which island you're talking about. Each one is different. We know that currently there are 7 islands which can be divided into 3 groups, or maybe 3 to 4 groups. The first island is Hark Island. We all know about Hark Island. It's been discussed for a long time. It's a key point for oil exports. The problem is that it's too close to mainland Iran, less than 20 nautical miles away, which is about 30-something kilometers. Even if you manage to control it, you'll constantly be under attack from Iranian drones or artillery shells, because at 30 kilometers, even a regular howitzer, of course with extended range, can hit it. So this is a challenge for the US. Also, Hark Island actually has a population of 8,000. While that's not a lot, it's a major military zone, so most of the people there basically take orders from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. There are some military personnel and some people related to the oil industry. Yeah, it's a challenge for the US. And the third challenge is that it's really far from the strait. If you look at a map, Hark Island It's already deep inside the Persian Gulf. How are you going to get there? Yeah, how are you going to get there? That's a real problem because right now you don't control the Strait of Hormuz. You can only fly over, but if you fly over, that brings up other issues. Like, where are you flying from? And will you be detected by the enemy when you fly in? So basically, it's doable to strike Hark Island. It's possible to fly in, but it might not be as easy as we imagine. The second option, which I think is the most likely to happen, is the three small islands west of the Strait of Hormuz: Greater Tomb, Lesser Tomb, and Abu Musa. If you look at the map, they're a certain distance from mainland Iran, about 80 to 100 kilometers or more. So it's not that easy for Iran to send reinforcements. Second, these islands are actually very small. If you look at them, each island has an airport, but aside from the airport, which basically takes up about half the island, there's not much else. That's pretty much the situation. So for the US, it's relatively easy to control these islands. With a provocation, it would be pretty easy to take them. And since they're far away, it's not that easy for Iran to interfere. Third, these islands have some geographical significance because these islands to the west of the Strait of Hormuz have become a bridgehead for Iran to monitor ships entering and leaving the Strait of Hormuz. Plus, they can use military force to threaten and control these areas, which is basically like controlling the entire Strait of Hormuz system. Fourth, these islands have always been a point of territorial dispute between the UAE and Iran. I've seen reports saying that the US could take advantage of the situation by handing these islands over to the UAE, and then the UAE could formally request the US to station troops there. This way, some legal issues or diplomatic friction could be resolved. So there are these four advantages. Now, the third option is the group of islands just north of the Hormuz Strait. Within this group, let's first talk about Keshm Island. Kesh is a large island, and if you look at the map, Keshm Island is very clearly visible. It's right across from Bandar Abbas and near Jask Island. It covers more than 1,400 square kilometers and has a population of over 150,000. In terms of both area and population, it's actually quite significant. Of course, the island also hosts some of Iran's most important naval bases, military installations, radar stations, and electronic stations. It's also the most crucial area for monitoring the Strait of Hormuz. If you look at it now, in recent days, haven't there been some cruise ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz? The route they take through the Strait of Hormuz isn't the usual one. They have to first turn north toward the area between Keshm Island and Larak Island, and only then do they return to the main shipping lane. What Iran is saying is, if you want to pass, you have to come to an understanding with us, follow this route, go through our inspection, and only then can you continue on your way. Of course, you also have to pay us a fee. So you could say that Keshm Island has extremely important strategic significance, but the problem is that its area is relatively large, and the distance, it's also very close to Iran's mainland. If the US really wants to attack Keshem Island, that's one of the reasons why the US keeps moving troops to the front lines. I think Keshem Island is on the US's blueprint. The three small islands I just mentioned are the easiest to attack and the easiest to take. I think if the US takes action, it will definitely go for them because it won't come at too high a cost. But attacking Keshm Island and Karg Island would still come with a certain price. There would be a cost to taking Keshm Island. The cost might be even higher because it's a bigger island with a larger population and it's closer to mainland Iran. But why is the US sending so many additional troops? I think they're preparing to take Keshm Island, the big island, because if you don't capture this major island, even if you take the smaller surrounding islands, you still can't fully control the entrance and exit of the Strait of Hormuz. If you look at the map, you'll see that Keshm Island is right on the northern side of the strait. Besides Keshm Island, there are three other islands: Hormuz Island, Larak Island, and another one. I forget its name. Anyway, these three are all small islands. They're really tiny. If you take Keshm Island, these three small islands can basically be taken easily as well. So that's the situation with the 7 or 8 islands in the Middle East. With the current US military strength, taking those three small islands wouldn't be a problem, and taking Karg Island shouldn't be an issue either. But taking Keshm Island would be more difficult. If they deploy even more troops, I think their target is very likely to be Keshm Island. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I noticed that since Trump mentioned Harg Island in his tweet and listed it alongside things like patrol boats and power plants, it seems like it's one of his main targets for attack. So is it possible that instead of attacking this island, he might actually bomb it? Could that be a possibility too?
Targeting Card Island is something Trump has considered since the 80s. I remember watching a video about it back then. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Just go in there.
not within a bit.
Now that he's finally become president of the United States, he can actually make that idea happen.
Old idea, revenge is a dish best served 40 years later.
Exactly. 40 years ago, the idea was that Karg Island was still there, and Iran was still considered a major hub for Europe. So it's actually not surprising that Trump had this idea. But the thing is, the importance of Karg Island to Iran and to the United States is not the same. That is to say, for Iran, it's an important export port. But for the US, controlling the Strait of Hormuz, it doesn't help the US at all. If Karg Island were taken, it would serve only one purpose, to be used as a bargaining chip at the negotiating table. The US actually doesn't care much about Iran's oil exports. Of course, economically speaking, being able to cut off the economic lifeline of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps would be significant, but it would also have an impact on the oil market. Because I remember just last week, I read a report saying that Trump not only lifted the oil ban on Russia, but also partially lifted the oil ban on Iran. Actually, Iran exporting oil is fine, as long as he cares more about oil prices and material interests. So for the US, the biggest use of this is as a bargaining chip. I'll use Karg Island as leverage. You can keep exporting oil, but you have to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. That, in my opinion, is the greatest bargaining value or significance of Karg Island for the US. From this perspective, could the US attack Karg Island? It's possible, but from the standpoint of military deception, the more the US talks about Karg Island, the more I feel like Karg Island might not actually be the target. That's just my personal feeling.
I've seen people say that the Persian Gulf coastline stretches for 1,800 kilometers, and that the extension of the Gulf of Oman is also several kilometers. So actually, the Strait of Hormuz is really long. If you only control a few small islands, can you really guarantee that the Strait of Hormuz will stay open? So based on what you just said, let's leave Karg Island out of the discussion. If it controls the other 7 islands, does it have to control all 7 at the same time to ensure the Strait of Hormuz stays open?
Yeah, that's right. You have to control all 7 of those islands. But the most important ones are Kesh Island and the 3 islands around it, because these islands are just north of the Strait of Hormuz, and the 2 sides of the Strait of Hormuz are shallow with a deeper channel in the middle. The navigable channel is only about 27 kilometers wide, with about 3 kilometers in the middle for ships to pass through.
And then Keshem.
Keshem Island has an elevation of 180 meters. If you stand on Keshem Island, that means you're at about 100 meters above sea level, and your line of sight can reach roughly 10 to 20 kilometers. So if you're standing on Keshem Island, as long as the weather's clear, you can see the ships coming and going. You can see them clearly with the naked eye, so the distance is really close. You have to take control of all the islands around Keshem Island, because otherwise I don't even need radar. I can spot your ships with my own eyes. Then I can just send a suicide drone boat or a suicide drone over there. It's just way too close. So for the United States, if they want to control the security of the Strait of Hormuz, they have to take Keshem Island. Along with that, the 3 small surrounding islands, the most crucial being Keshem Island, need to be taken as well. Honestly, that's all negotiable. I've even seen people say there could be a ground assault to enter Abu Musa port, which is across from Keshem Island. But personally, I don't think the United States is likely to get involved in landing on Iranian territory. Because defending an island and defending the mainland are completely different. An island has a natural boundary. If I'm surrounded by water, it's easier for me to defend. But if I land at a port and then have to fight in the city, wow, that's just too much trouble. That would turn into another Iraq or Afghanistan. So I don't think so, because any ground operations the US launches now face a lot of resistance. I don't think the United States will get involved in Iran. It's possible for the mainland to control the islands, but I think landing at the ports is unlikely.
So do you think a force of just over 10,000 troops is enough to control all 7 of these islands?
Yeah, that's not a problem.
But what about the main island? Because there's the main island, and then there's the issue of logistics.
That's how it is. For the United States, a direct confrontation on the battlefield has never been an issue. For the US, you're saying Iran would launch an amphibious assault to take the islands back. That's absolutely impossible for Iran.
They won't return, but it might just be harassment.
Right. For the US and for Iran, what Iran is really trying to do is just one thing: increase American casualties. If you take these islands, then you take them. There's nothing I can do about it. But what I want is to cause you the greatest casualties during and after this process. Why? Karg Island? Personally, I doubt it a lot because we've been arguing about this for so long. In the past week, Iran has already sent reinforcements to Karg Island, like deploying more advanced defensive weapons. For example, some naval mines or some landmines. Of course, when the war starts, the US will definitely try to clear them as much as possible, but you can't get rid of everything. You can't clear them completely, so when your helicopters are flying low, especially when the other side is anticipating your moves, it becomes really easy for them to get hit by these kinds of semi-active, surveillance-guided anti-air missiles. For example, they have some real anti-air missiles imported from the Soviet Union and some Igla anti-air missiles they got from Blackstone, which can shoot you down. Take the early days of the Ukraine war, for example, when the Russians launched the surprise attack. At Antonov Airport, we saw a line of helicopters flying low, almost hugging the ground, heading straight for Antonov Airport. As a result, several helicopters were shot down on the way by Ukraine's Igla missiles. So if the US really wants to attack Karg Island, Iran won't be able to stop them. But Iran can inflict more casualties. In addition, the biggest headache for Americans when it comes to casualties is, what do I do after I take it? For example, with a small island, it's not a big deal because there aren't many people there. Basically, it just becomes yours. The people on the island are mostly military personnel anyway. But take Karg Island, for example. It has 8,000 people. Keshm Island has 150,000 people. With so many people, how are you supposed to manage? There are definitely people from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or people who have infiltrated in various ways. If they carry out some kind of attack or something else, that's a problem you have to deal with. Another thing is that Kesh Island and Hark Island are just too close to mainland Iran. Kesh Island is right across from the port. I can launch missiles and drones at your military base right from the port. Isn't that super easy? You'd be harassed like this all the time, every few days. So I think this is what gives the US a bit of a headache. The real problem is never the direct battlefield, but rather what happens after you see these missiles. What kind of situation will you face then? What kind of situation are we talking about?
There's also another issue. Why is Iran able to keep launching missiles? For the Gulf countries, this is a huge headache. Just yesterday, it seems like the UAE was hit by another round of missile and drone attacks. Logically speaking, the US and Israel are saying they've already destroyed 90% of Iran's missiles, or at least their capabilities. But there are also different intelligence sources. Some say otherwise. In fact, some sources claim they've only destroyed 30% of Iran's missile capabilities. So what's your take on Iran's missiles?
I think both of these are actually correct because they're talking about different things. The 90% refers to Iran's missile launch vehicles, while the 1% refers to Iran's missile stockpile. These are not the same thing. I could have 1,000 missiles, but maybe only 100 launch vehicles. If I lose the launch vehicles, all those missiles in storage can't be launched anyway. At the start of the war, because Iran was launching a large number of missiles, as soon as they launched, they would be spotted by US drones or surveillance equipment. Once spotted, they'd be targeted. So at that time, Israel had data saying they'd already cleared out 90% of the launch vehicles. I think that number is relatively accurate. If not 90%, then at least 80%. But Iran still has a large stockpile. It's just that they didn't have time to launch them. When I say only 1% was destroyed, that's referring to the missile stockpile, which is different from destroying launch vehicles. Later, we saw a lot of videos showing bunkers and underground ammo depots being bombed. Those were missile stockpiles being destroyed. And supposedly, about a third lost their capability. Like if the entrances to underground warehouses were bombed, so those missiles inside aren't a threat for now. I saw some people saying there's still about a third of the missile stockpile left. As for why we're still seeing missile launch vehicles now, there are a few reasons why we continue to see Gulf countries being hit by missile attacks. The first reason is that Iran is a vast country with a lot of territory. In central Iran, I've seen maps made by open source intelligence showing that the US military strikes the south, central, and western regions. But if you look at the eastern and northeastern areas, they actually haven't been bombed as heavily because they're farther from the coastline. Israel can't reach them since Israel doesn't have heavy bombers. The US can reach those areas, but right now, America's mainly focused on the southern coast. So there are still some regions that the US hasn't cleared yet, which means there could still be some missile launch vehicles there. Of course, those places are even farther from the front lines, so they might launch some medium-range ballistic missiles, say with a range of over 1,000 miles or even 2,000 miles. But the farther the range, the faster the missile, and the harder it is to intercept. The better its interception capabilities, the more effective it is. So, what we're seeing is that even though there are fewer missiles being launched later on, Israel still seems to be taking some hits. And this is one of the reasons why. That's one point. The second reason is, for example, when you bomb some underground bunkers or their entrances and exits, you might destroy the entrance, but after it's cleared, it can move overnight, or vehicles I send out can come back again. In short, there are always some that slip through the cracks. That's why, even after a month of fighting, Iran still has the ability to launch drones and missiles. Although the number is getting smaller and smaller, maybe just a dozen or so missiles and over 20 drones each day. Last week, for example, the Sudan Prince Air Base, which is an important Saudi Air Force base, was hit by Iranian missiles. This resulted in several refueling planes and even an E-3 AWACS being damaged. I believe these were all launched by Iran's medium and long-range ballistic missiles, and their launch bases are not located along the southern coast or the western border, but rather in the northeastern region. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I think the current situation, it's gotten a bit complicated. It seems like the Houthi forces have reportedly started to join the fight as well, causing trouble for Israel. And of course, there are other Gulf countries saying that if you really want this war to end, you have to eliminate the threat from Iran completely. Otherwise, any lingering issues would be unacceptable for the Middle East region. So now it looks like the Gulf countries are also considering whether or not to get involved in the war to some extent. As for the U.S., I heard Rubio say that the U.S. wants to end this war within 2 to 4 weeks, but I think that timeline is a bit tight. It's early April now, and if Trump really plans to end the war by the end of April, then it's very likely that his approach would be something like, even if I have to send in more troops, it would be for occupation, but not a long-term one. Maybe at a certain point, I'll decide it's time to withdraw. If Iran still hasn't opened up, then, just like Trump tweeted, I'll give you one final blow, but after that, we'll pull out completely. So what do you think about the direction of this war and where it might end?
I think this war is like this. The U.S. has achieved success from a military perspective, but strategically speaking, right now it's facing major difficulties. The biggest challenge is with the primary strategic objective. The Iranian regime hasn't been overthrown, and in the foreseeable future, the likelihood of regime change in Iran is pretty low. This means there's a problem. If you don't overthrow the Iranian regime, in the end, you'll still have to negotiate with them, right? It's always going to be there, and in one way or another, you'll have to negotiate with them. But right now, there's another issue. The Iranian regime still seems to be dominated by hardliners. If the U.S. takes even more aggressive actions like bombing infrastructure or, say, seizing Abu Musa and Greater Tund Islands, which might be a bit less serious, but if they go after other islands, wouldn't that escalate tensions between the two sides and shrink the space for diplomatic negotiations? Let's take the simplest example. Suppose the U.S. captures all 7 islands, including Hark Island. Even after taking them, Iran might not be in a hurry. As long as the regime doesn't fall, they might just let the U.S. bomb away. Afghanistan was bombed for 10 years, and Iraq only saw regime change after 2 Gulf wars and then the Iraq War. So for Iran isn't in a rush about this. The clock is on the side of the Iranian regime, but it's different for the U.S. The U.S., or rather Trump, has 2 ticking clocks over his head. The first is 60 days, because according to U.S. law, you can only wage war for 60 days. After those 60 days, you have another 30 days to withdraw troops. That clock is always ticking. If you look at the meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping, it's scheduled for mid-May, which is exactly 2.5 months from February 28th. In other words, Trump thinks, I have to end this war within 2 months. That's the goal he set. He has to end this war within 2 months so he can go to China in May. So for the U.S., there's a ticking clock. Time is not on their side. The second thing is the Strait of Hormuz. The longer the situation drags on in the Strait of Hormuz, the more the global economy and stock markets will be impacted. We've seen that from the latter half of last week into this week. The U.S. stock market has been dropping dramatically, and Asian markets have been hit even harder. The Nikkei and Korea's indexes are all falling, and this is going to have a huge impact. For example, Qatar. Qatar is also a major export of LNG and helium is related to the semiconductor industry. So this situation affects all kinds of industries, not just oil, even semiconductors are involved. For Trump and the US, they have to take responsibility for the global economy and for the US economy. All Americans' retirement funds are tied up in the stock market. Every government pension fund, California's, New York's, they're all invested in the market. So what are you going to do? You can't just let it go. That's why Trump is under so much pressure. He's got two ticking clocks over his head. Time is not on America's side, and that's the biggest problem the US is facing. Even if the US manages to take over 7 islands, I don't think this is something that can be resolved in a short time, like 2 to 4 weeks. After taking those 7 islands, are you just going to leave after 2 to 4 weeks? So what's the point of taking over these islands? The US really only has 2 options. One, take control of these islands and use them as bargaining chips to force the Iranian regime into an agreement, basically saying, I can give some of the islands back to you if we reach a deal, and you keep the Strait of Hormuz open. The second option is, if Iran still refuses the terms, the US would have to station troops there long term, which would be extremely disadvantageous for America. So the real difficulty for the US right now is that unless the Iranian regime is overthrown, which isn't happening, they have to reach some kind of agreement with Iran before they can withdraw. And how do you actually reach that agreement? I think that's the biggest challenge they're facing.
I think there's actually a third option. The US could just pull out when the time comes. But if they do withdraw, first, they'd bomb a lot of your infrastructure to the ground. Second, the Gulf countries, Israel, and even NATO would have to step in. Honestly, as Trump has repeatedly said, this shipping lane isn't that big of a problem for the US. Well, that's what he says, but it is still an issue for America. However, for Asian countries, NATO, and Europe, it's definitely a problem. That's why Rubio keeps bringing it up in Europe, saying that European countries also have a responsibility here. The Gulf countries are also getting more actively involved now, so it's possible that, to some extent, after the U.S. reaches an agreement with these countries, everyone would jointly escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz. That's why I think Trump and Iran both know there's a time limit. That's why they're saying if an agreement can't be reached quickly, they'll just destroy everything. After all, they're not planning to fight a prolonged war here, but the U.S. won't gain anything out of it either. Is it possible that this is the third option?
Here's how I see this issue. Just look at the other NATO countries. Even sending a minesweeper is so difficult for them. It's pretty unlikely you could get them to help the U.S. occupy islands, including Israel for that matter. Today I saw a report saying that Israel won't be sending ground troops. Of course, this news isn't official, but you can see that even providing escort is so difficult for these countries. I really don't think it's likely you could get them to control these islands. So for the U.S., if they really do take them, these 7 or 8 islands, except for Abu Musa Island and Greater Tumb Island, which could be handed over to the UAE, the rest of these islands are just too close to Iran, so no country dares to take them over. Because once you take them over, you'll get caught up in a conflict with Iran.
Any confrontation. Escorting is problematic. If they station troops and then withdraw, the Strait of Hormuz returns to Iran's control. Exactly. Escorting is problematic. How would the world react? Like Rubio said, privatizing an international waterway and charging fees is unacceptable. The world won't stand for it. If Iran does this, everyone faces a major challenge. So what would you do? This isn't just America's problem, right?
That's right. That is to say, if you withdraw from Keshem Island and other islands north of the Strait of Hormuz, your escort missions would become full of danger because Keshem Island is just too close to the strait. Iran's right there. If a real conflict breaks out, things like artillery, missiles, unmanned boats, and drones will give your escort fleet a huge headache. That's why back in early February, we said, and the US said in early March, that they might provide escort services by the end of March. Now, it's already the end of March, and the US still hasn't provided any escort. Back then, I already doubted this whole escort thing. Even saying by the end of March was a pretty optimistic take. I even think that for quite a long time, as long as there's no island seizure operation, the US Navy won't be offering any escort services. So islands and escort operations, they're closely related. And in fact, controlling the islands is even a prerequisite. Because only if you control these islands can you ensure the safety of the sea lanes. Only then can your warships enter and provide further protection. If you don't control these islands, even the United States wouldn't want to come in. How could other countries possibly come in to provide escort? So that's the current dilemma we're facing.
From all the analysis I've seen, in the end, regime change is still the ultimate solution.
Yeah, that's Trump. When the US government first launched this kind of war, it was all about regime change. After that, there was nothing left for you to worry about. If there's a regime change, then the issue of nuclear fuel won't exist anymore. The Strait of Hormuz won't be a problem either. Right. Ending the conflict in a week would be the most ideal and optimistic scenario. That's what we would all like to see, but the only regret is that is to say, it seems like this Islamic regime is even more stable than people imagined, a bit more stable than Mossad expected to. So this will bring about
A whole series of problems. From what I've seen in the news, I don't know if it's changed now, but at the very beginning, Mossad assessed that a regime change in Iran might take about a year. But whether that changed later on, I really don't know. And then there's Trump himself. Of course, he also talked about regime change. But in his definition, that wasn't regime change. It was just a change in leadership. Leadership is already changed. After 2 waves were killed in bombings, including Larijani, they're now on the 3rd. He said they're talking of his 3rd wave, meaning the regime has already cycled through 3 leadership changes. So Trump redefined the meaning of regime change.
That's right. But most people probably can't accept this because it's like with the Chinese Communist Party, when you say Mao Zedong died and Deng Xiaoping took over, is that really regime change? It's still the same system. Yes, the US hopes that a relatively moderate faction will emerge from within the current regime. Someone who can reach an agreement with the United States would be similar to Venezuela's Vice President Rodriguez, a candidate like that emerging. But right now, it doesn't look like Prigozhin is moving in that direction. It's really difficult.
He'd need the military, I don't know. Strictly speaking, the National Defense Force is a separate military force. I think no matter who emerges, if this moderate faction needs someone whose word actually counts, it'd have to have military backing. The Revolutionary Guard definitely wouldn't support them. So is it possible for the National Defense Force to do so? That I really don't know.
To be honest, why was the National Defense Force established in the first place? The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps? Because when the Islamic regime first came to power, when Khomeini took over, actually things were unstable domestically with many different factions. So they used the Revolutionary Guard to take control of the military power from the National Defense Force. It's kind of like what I designed. By establishing this guard, I took away the military authority from the regular troops. But as things developed over the past few decades, under the Islamic regime, the leaders of the National Defense Force were actually also appointed by them. They were people appointed by the Islamic regime and had close ties with them. The only difference is that they weren't members of the Islamic Revolutionary Committee. Such enormous power and even such significant economic strength because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which many people might not realize, is estimated by some to be connected to as much as 40% of Iran's GDP. That's because it's not just a military force. Under it, there are a huge number of enterprises, including construction and oil fields. They develop infrastructure. And then when it comes to exporting oil, just look. Those shadow fleets from Iran export oil to China and other places. All of this is operated by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is why the IRGC has become a very large economic, political, and military conglomerate. So the situation is indeed more difficult, mainly because the strength behind the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is still quite considerable. It really is.
So that's really how it is, which makes it completely different from the situation in Venezuela. All right, let's keep watching how this situation in this war develops. Thank you so much, Zitting, for coming to give us your analysis again today. I believe we'll probably invite you back again in a few days, so you can continue to help us interpret the latest developments in the situation. That's it for today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.